Look at a map of the world. For centuries, a vast swathe of it, continents, islands, oceans, bore the unmistakable mark of a single island nation. This was the British Empire, an entity so colossal, so influential, that its echoes still resonate in our laws, our languages, our economies, and our very understanding of the modern world. From the windswept shores of England, a nation once fractured by internal strife and foreign invaders, grew a power that would eventually govern nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and command a quarter of its population. It was an empire built on a curious blend of ambition and pragmatism, technological prowess and sheer brutality, economic necessity, and a sometimes dubious sense of moral mission. But what was the British Empire? It wasn't a static entity. It was a protean force, constantly evolving, expanding, contracting, and redefining itself over more than 3 centuries. It began not with grand imperial designs, but with tentative voyages of discovery driven by a thirst for wealth and a challenge to established European powers. It ballooned through exploration, trade, conquest, and the strategic acquisition of territories. It reached its zenith, a sprawling, interconnected web of dominions, colonies, protectorates, and mandates, held together by the sinews of naval power, industrial might, and a complex administrative apparatus. Yet this monumental edifice also contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The very ideas of liberty and self-determination, often propagated by the British themselves, would ignite nationalist movements that ultimately led to its dismantling. The story of the British Empire isn't simply one of triumph and expansion, it's also one of immense human cost, exploitation, resistance, and profound, sometimes traumatic, cultural collision. In this monumental series, we embark on an epic journey, a comprehensive exploration of the British Empire's entire history. From its earliest unassuming roots in medieval England to its final twilight and enduring legacy in the 21st century, we'll uncover the pivotal moments, the towering figures, the shifting philosophies, and the countless millions of lives irrevocably shaped by this extraordinary global phenomenon. Prepare to witness the entire history of the British Empire. Its story is our story, a testament to humanity's capacity for both monumental achievement and devastating impact. Before Britannia ruled the waves, before even a unified England truly existed, the island of Great Britain was a patchwork of warring kingdoms, often at the mercy of invaders. Our story of empire, surprisingly, begins not with ships sailing to distant lands, but with the very formation of the core nation itself. We must first understand the crucible from which future imperial ambitions would emerge. For centuries after the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, what we now call England was fragmented. Anglo-Saxon tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, carved out their own kingdoms, fiercely independent, yet constantly vying for supremacy. These were the nascent states of Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. Their struggles were brutal, their borders fluid, and their allegiances fleeting. The concept of a singular English identity was still embryonic. Instead, life revolved around local loyalties, agricultural rhythms, and the looming threat of invasion. For generations, the most persistent and terrifying threat came from the sea, the Vikings. From the late 8th century, Norse raiders, often in their swift, terrifying longships, began to strike. They plundered monasteries, sacked towns, and eventually began to settle. The Danelaw, a vast area of eastern England, became a testament to their pervasive influence, bringing new customs, laws, and even linguistic elements. It was in this turbulent environment that the foundations for a more centralized kingdom began to coalesce. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex in the late 9th century, is often credited as a pivotal figure. He not only successfully resisted the Viking onslaught, but also laid the groundwork for a unified English monarchy. His military reforms, his emphasis on learning and law, and his strategic fortresses, the burhs, created a stronger, more resilient state. He wasn't just a warrior king, he was a visionary who understood the importance of administrative stability and cultural revival. Over the next century, Alfred's successors continued this process of unification. Athelstan, his grandson, effectively became the first king of England in the 10th century, forging a kingdom that stretched from the Channel to the Scottish borders. This was a remarkable achievement, binding together disparate peoples under a single crown, though the unity was often fragile, tested by internal rebellions and renewed Viking incursions. This period also saw the development of a sophisticated administrative system with shires and hundreds, foreshadowing later centralized governance. The Anglo-Saxon period, despite its often violent nature, was crucial for the development of distinct English legal traditions, parliamentary roots in the Witenagemot, an assembly of wise men, and a unique cultural identity. The English language itself, a Germanic tongue heavily influenced by Latin and later Norse, began to take shape. These were the bedrock elements that would define the character of the emerging nation. Then came 1066, a year etched into the very fabric of English history. The death of Edward the Confessor, the childless king, plunged England into a succession crisis. Three claimants emerged. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, elected by the English Witan; Harald Hardrada, the formidable King of Norway, representing the last gasp of the Viking Age; and William, Duke of Normandy, a ruthless and ambitious ruler from across the Channel, claiming a prior promise from Edward. The events of that year unfolded with breathtaking speed and brutality. First, Harold Godwinson marched north to face Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a decisive English victory that ended Norse ambitions in England forever. But just days later, exhausted and having marched his army hundreds of miles south, Harold faced William at the Battle of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings wasn't merely a clash of armies, it was a clash of cultures, a turning point that fundamentally reshaped England. William's Norman knights, with their superior cavalry and archers, ultimately broke the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. Harold's death, famously, perhaps apocryphally, from an arrow to the eye, sealed the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman conquest, though initially met with fierce resistance, was swift and decisive. William the Conqueror brutally suppressed rebellions, confiscated land, and installed a new Norman aristocracy. This wasn't just a change of monarch, it was a revolution from above. Norman French became the language of the court, law, and administration, profoundly influencing the English language and separating the ruling class from the common people. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1085, was an unprecedented survey of land and resources, a testament to the new regime's desire for absolute control and efficient taxation. It cemented the Norman grip on power and formalized the feudal system, a rigid social hierarchy based on land tenure and loyalty to the king. The Norman conquest had far-reaching consequences. It integrated England more closely into continental European affairs, particularly through its ties to Normandy and later the vast Angevin Empire. It introduced new administrative practices, legal systems, and military strategies. Critically, it instilled in the English monarchy a strong, centralized authority, laying the very groundwork for a powerful state capable of projecting its influence outwards. While the Anglo-Saxon past contributed its unique heritage, it was the Norman injection of ambition, control, and a more expansive European outlook that unwittingly set England on a future path towards global power. The island was now firmly anchored in the continental power struggles, but its internal strength was being forged, ready for centuries of growth and eventual expansion beyond its shores. Medieval England and early continental ambitions, 1066-1485. With the Normans firmly in control, England became a more unified, if often turbulent, kingdom. Yet, its gaze remained largely fixed across the Channel. The personal holdings of the English kings in France, inherited from William the Conqueror and later expanded by powerful dynasties like the Angevins, meant that England's destiny was intrinsically linked to the volatile politics of continental Europe. This period, stretching from the Norman conquest through the Wars of the Roses, saw England repeatedly embroiled in conflicts that would shape its identity and, paradoxically, limit its early imperial aspirations. The Anglo-Norman realm, established by William, was a dual entity, a kingdom in England and a duchy in France. This inherent tension would define centuries of Anglo-French relations. Henry II, who ascended the throne in 1154, truly expanded this continental reach. Through inheritance, marriage, and conquest, he presided over the vast Angevin Empire, a sprawling dominion that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and more. This vast continental empire, though impressive, was a constant source of drain and conflict. The English kings, paradoxically, were often more French than English, spending much of their time defending their continental possessions. Richard the Lionheart, famed for his crusading prowess, epitomized this focus. His absence from England, while celebrated in legend, left the kingdom vulnerable and financially depleted. His successor, King John, famously lost most of these French territories, including Normandy itself, to King Philip II of France by 1214. This catastrophic loss, though humiliating for John, was a watershed moment. It forced the English monarchy to refocus its attention and resources primarily on England and its immediate island neighbors. Despite, or perhaps because of, this inward turn, England continued to develop internally. Magna Carta, signed in 1215 by King John under duress from his barons, was a landmark document. While initially a feudal compact, it laid crucial groundwork for constitutionalism and the rule of law, limiting the absolute power of the monarch. This was a foundational step in the development of a unique English legal and political system, one that would eventually become a cornerstone of future imperial administration. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the emergence of Parliament, evolving from the Witenagemot and the Great Council into a more representative body that included knights and burgesses. This developing institution, with its growing power over taxation and legislation, would be crucial for mobilizing the resources needed for future ventures. However, England's continental ambitions were far from extinguished. The Plantagenet claim to the French throne, inherited through marriage, festered for decades, culminating in the 100 Years' War, a series of conflicts that spanned over a century, from 1337 to 1453. This was not a continuous war, but a succession of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities driven by dynastic claims and territorial disputes. The early phases of the war saw spectacular English victories, thanks to innovations like the longbow, which decimated French cavalry at Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356. These battles showcased English military prowess and instilled a sense of national pride. Henry V's triumph at Agincourt in 1415, immortalized by Shakespeare, seemed to cement English dominance in France, even leading to Henry V being declared heir to the French throne. Yet, despite these dazzling victories, the human and financial cost of the war was immense. The Black Death, which ravaged England in the mid-14th century, wiping out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, profoundly impacted society, labor, and the economy, further complicating the war effort. The rise of Joan of Arc and a resurgent French national identity eventually turned the tide. By 1453, England had lost virtually all its continental possessions, retaining only the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War, though ultimately a failure in its continental aims, had a profound and lasting impact on England. It forced the nation to consolidate its identity, distinguishing itself from its French neighbors. English, not French, became the dominant language of the court and the legal system. It also honed England's military capabilities, particularly its naval strength, which would prove invaluable in future global endeavors. No sooner had the dust settled from the French wars than England plunged into another devastating internal conflict, the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. This dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and York, the white rose, tore the country apart for 3 decades. It was a brutal and bloody contest for the throne, involving prominent noble families and cycles of shifting allegiances. The conflict weakened the old feudal aristocracy and left the English monarchy in a precarious state. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the decisive end of the wars, with the victory of Henry Tudor over Richard III. Henry, a Lancastrian claimant, then married Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the two warring houses and founding the Tudor dynasty. This ushered in a new era of relative peace and stability, critical for rebuilding the nation's strength and vision. By 1485, England was a nation scarred by centuries of internal and external conflict. Its continental ambitions had been largely thwarted, forcing a pragmatic focus on its own island. However, this period of intense formation had also forged a stronger, more unified, and increasingly distinct English identity. With a more centralized monarchy emerging from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, England was finally ready to look beyond its internal struggles and its immediate European concerns. The stage was set for a new kind of expansion, one that would turn its gaze not to the old battlefields of France, but to the vast uncharted oceans beyond. The seeds of global ambition were about to be sown. The ascension of Henry VII in 1485 marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the dawn of the Tudor dynasty. This was a pivotal moment as the Tudors, recognizing the limitations of continental expansion, began to consolidate power at home and look outwards. While Spain and Portugal were already carving out vast empires in the Americas and Asia, England, still recovering from its internal turmoil, was a relatively minor player on the global stage. Yet, it was during this period that the fundamental shifts occurred, laying the intellectual, economic, and maritime groundwork for what would become the British Empire. Henry VII, a shrewd and pragmatic monarch, prioritized financial stability and the strengthening of the crown. He avoided costly foreign wars, instead focusing on rebuilding royal finances, fostering trade, and consolidating central authority. His most significant, though initially modest, contribution to future empire was his sponsorship of John Cabot. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached the coast of North America, likely Newfoundland. He claimed the land for England, planting a flag and providing the basis for future English claims to the continent. However, these early voyages were sporadic. England lacked the capital, the naval technology, and perhaps the immediate motivation of Spain, which was harvesting vast wealth from its American colonies. The early 16th century saw England largely preoccupied with its own internal affairs, most notably the seismic changes under Henry VIII. Henry VIII's reign, 1509 to 1547, was dominated by his break with the Roman Catholic Church. The English Reformation wasn't merely a theological dispute. It was a profound act of state-building, consolidating royal power and seizing vast wealth from the monasteries. This act of defiance against the papacy also isolated England somewhat from Catholic Europe, inadvertently fostering a greater sense of national distinctiveness and self-reliance, paving the way for independent foreign policy and trade routes. Furthermore, Henry VIII understood the critical importance of naval power. He invested heavily in building a formidable navy, creating purpose-built warships with heavy guns, transforming England from a medieval maritime nation into a serious naval force. Ships like the Mary Rose, though lost, were symbols of this new naval ambition. This strategic foresight would prove invaluable for projecting English power across oceans in the centuries to come. Under his children, Edward VI and Mary Wine, England swung between Protestantism and Catholicism, further highlighting the internal religious tensions. But it was Elizabeth I who ascended the throne in 1558, who would preside over the true dawn of English global ambition. Elizabeth's reign, 1558-1603, coincided with a period of intense rivalry with Spain, the dominant global power. Spain's vast wealth from its American silver mines, its powerful armada, and its zealous Catholicism presented a direct threat to Protestant England. This rivalry drove English mariners, sometimes with state sponsorship, to engage in privateering, essentially state-sanctioned piracy, against Spanish treasure ships. Figures like Francis Drake and John Hawkins became national heroes, plundering Spanish silver and circumnavigating the globe, proving that English ships could operate far from home shores. Drake's circumnavigation, 1577 to 1580, was a monumental achievement, not just for its daring but for its symbolic significance. It shattered the myth of Spanish and Portuguese exclusivity in global exploration and demonstrated England's growing maritime capabilities. These voyages were as much about reconnaissance and challenging Spanish dominance as they were about pure exploration. Simultaneously, serious attempts at colonization began. Humphrey Gilbert and his half-brother Walter Raleigh championed the idea of establishing permanent English settlements in North America. Their motivations were complex: to find a northwest passage to Asia, to discover new resources, gold, furs, to provide bases for raiding Spanish shipping, and to create new markets for English goods. The most famous and tragic of these early ventures was the Roanoke colony in present-day North Carolina. Raleigh sponsored expeditions in the 1580s, but the settlements faced immense challenges: harsh climate, hostile indigenous populations, and logistical difficulties. The mysterious disappearance of the lost colony of Roanoke by 1590 served as a harsh lesson in the realities of overseas colonization. It was far more difficult and dangerous than imagined. Despite these setbacks, the drive for empire was gaining momentum. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a psychological and strategic turning point. While not a complete destruction of Spanish naval power, it demonstrated England's ability to defend itself against the mightiest empire of the day and signaled a shift in global maritime power. England had proven its mettle on the seas. Towards the very end of Elizabeth's reign, a crucial new entity was formed: the East India Company. Chartered in 1600, this joint stock company represented a new model for overseas expansion. It was not a direct state enterprise, but a private company granted a royal monopoly on trade with the East Indies. Its initial focus was spices, but it would eventually grow into a colossal power, laying the foundations for Britain's vast empire in India. This marked a shift from mere exploration and privateering to organized, state-backed commercial expansion. By the time of Elizabeth's death in 1603, England was still far from being a global empire. Its colonial ventures were tentative, its successes limited. Yet the seeds had been sown: a strong, independent monarchy, a formidable navy, a culture of daring maritime exploration, and the institutional innovation of the Joint Stock Company. The focus on naval power, the challenging of Spanish dominance, and the pragmatic pursuit of wealth had set the stage. The next century would see these tentative steps transform into genuine, sustained colonial expansion. While Elizabeth I's reign formally marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, its impact on shaping England's nascent imperial ambitions was so profound that it deserves its own dedicated exploration. Her rule was a crucible in which a fragmented, insecure island nation began to forge the tools and the mindset required for global dominance. It was a period defined by shrewd statecraft, audacious mariners, and a growing, often ruthless economic pragmatism that set England on an irreversible path towards empire. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, England was perceived as a second-tier European power, economically and militarily outmatched by Spain and France. Its religious identity was in flux, and its internal stability was often precarious. Elizabeth's primary objective was survival, to secure her Protestant throne against Catholic conspiracies, both internal and external, and to maintain a delicate balance of power in Europe. Yet, within this defensive posture, the seeds of an aggressive global reach were sown. Crucially, Elizabeth inherited and expanded her father Henry VIII's naval legacy. She understood that England's island status made a powerful navy not a luxury, but a necessity for defense and projection of influence. Her focus on building agile, heavily armed warships, designed for maneuverability rather than just size, proved revolutionary. These were the ships that would eventually challenge and defeat the Spanish Armada. The economic driver for early English expansion was mercantilism, the prevailing economic theory of the age. Mercantilism dictated that national wealth was finite and measured in gold and silver bullion. To acquire this wealth, a nation must export more than it imports, and colonies served as crucial sources of raw materials and captive markets for manufactured goods. Elizabeth's government, though not always directly funding expeditions, provided charters, monopolies, and often a blind eye to the less savory aspects of privateering, effectively decentralizing the risk of early imperial ventures to private individuals and joint stock companies. This era saw the rise of the sea dogs, daring navigators, explorers, and often outright pirates who operated with varying degrees of official sanction. Figures like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher became national heroes. Hawkins pioneered the English involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, a dark chapter that provided immense profits, though it was cloaked in the guise of trading voyages. Drake, with his circumnavigation of the globe, not only brought back immense Spanish treasure, but also demonstrated England's capacity for global reach. His exploits were acts of defiance against Spanish supremacy, blurring the lines between exploration, trade, and outright piracy. The rivalry with Spain intensified throughout Elizabeth's reign. Spain's vast American empire, fueled by silver from Potosi, made it the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe. English privateering was a direct assault on this wealth. This escalating tension culminated in the infamous Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip II of Spain, a devout Catholic and a longtime adversary of Elizabeth, launched a massive invasion fleet with the aim of crushing Protestant England and restoring Catholic rule. The defeat of the Armada was a monumental victory for England. It was achieved through a combination of superior English ship design, innovative naval tactics, using fire ships to break Spanish formations, and crucially, severe storms that scattered the Spanish fleet. This victory, often exaggerated in its immediate impact on Spanish power, was nevertheless a psychological triumph. It solidified England's Protestant identity, bolstered national confidence, and perhaps most importantly, confirmed England's growing status as a formidable naval power, capable of defending its shores and projecting its influence across the oceans. It effectively signaled that the seas were no longer exclusively Spanish territory. Beyond defense, Elizabeth's reign also saw the first serious, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempts at establishing permanent English colonies in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of the Queen, spearheaded the efforts to colonize Virginia, named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. The Roanoke colony, founded in 1585 and then resettled in 1587, was meant to be England's first permanent foothold in North America. These ventures faced immense challenges: harsh environments, inadequate supplies, disease, and complex relations with indigenous populations. The tragic fate of the lost colony of Roanoke, whose inhabitants vanished without a trace by 1590, was a stark reminder of the difficulties and dangers inherent in overseas expansion. Despite these failures, the idea of a permanent English presence across the Atlantic was now firmly established. The lessons learned from Roanoke about the need for better planning, sustained investment, and realistic expectations would inform future, more successful colonial ventures. Finally, in 1600, just 3 years before Elizabeth's death, a group of London merchants received a royal charter to form the Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, soon to be known simply as the East India Company. This was a landmark moment. It was a joint stock company, meaning investors pooled their capital, sharing the risks and rewards. This model bypassed direct state expenditure and proved incredibly effective for financing large, long-term, and risky overseas ventures. While initially focused on challenging Dutch dominance in the spice trade, the East India Company would over the next 2 centuries transform itself from a trading entity into the de facto ruler of a vast Indian subcontinent, laying the foundation for Britain's most valuable imperial possession. By 1603, Elizabeth I had not created an empire in the same vein as Spain or Portugal, but she had provided the essential ingredients: a strong, unified, and Protestant nation, a formidable and battle-tested navy, a cadre of experienced mariners and adventurers, a growing understanding of global trade and economics, and the institutional framework, like the East India Company, for sustained overseas expansion. Her reign instilled in the English a sense of confidence and a taste for maritime adventure. The foundation stones were laid. The next monarchs would begin to build the vast edifice of the British Empire. The Stuarts and the first permanent colonies, 1603-1688. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603 brought the Tudor dynasty to an end, ushering in the Stuart era with the ascension of James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland were united, forming Great Britain in name, if not yet in full political union. This new dynasty, while grappling with profound internal conflicts, also oversaw the crucial transition from tentative exploration to the establishment of England's first permanent and successful overseas colonies, the very bedrock of its future empire. The initial motivation remained largely economic: the desire to find gold and silver, discover a northwest passage to Asia, and secure new markets and resources independent of rival European powers, particularly Spain. Private adventurers and joint stock companies, rather than the crown directly, largely financed these risky ventures, mitigating royal financial exposure but requiring substantial private investment. In 1607, a landmark event occurred: the establishment of Jamestown in Virginia. Sponsored by the Virginia Company of London, this was England's first enduring settlement in North America. Its early years were brutal, marked by disease, starvation, and often hostile relations with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. Only the sheer grit of the colonists, aided by figures like Captain John Smith and the unexpected discovery of tobacco as a cash crop, saved the struggling venture from collapse. Tobacco, in particular, created a voracious demand back in England, transforming Virginia into a viable, albeit labor-intensive, plantation economy. The success of Jamestown, however, came at a terrible cost. The increasing demand for land for tobacco cultivation led to relentless encroachment on Native American territories, fueling devastating conflicts. Furthermore, the labor demands of tobacco cultivation quickly surpassed the supply of indentured servants from England. This desperate need for labor led directly to the introduction of African chattel slavery in the English colonies, beginning as early as 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia. This insidious system would become a cornerstone of the burgeoning British Empire, particularly in the lucrative Caribbean sugar islands, leaving a legacy of immense suffering and injustice. Simultaneously, a very different kind of English settlement was taking root further north. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, the Pilgrims, landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their motivations were primarily religious freedom, seeking to escape persecution in England and establish a society based on their Puritan ideals. This led to the formation of the New England colonies, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, Rhode Island, characterized by smaller farms, strong community ties, town meetings, and a deep-seated commitment to religious principles, though often intolerant of dissent. Throughout the 17th century, English colonization diversified and expanded rapidly. The Caribbean islands became immensely valuable, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, as they proved ideal for growing sugar, a highly lucrative cash crop. The sugar plantations were wholly reliant on the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor, generating vast fortunes for British merchants and landowners. The wealth generated from sugar was arguably the single most important economic engine of the early British Empire. Further north, the Middle Colonies, New York, seized from the Dutch in 1664, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, developed as more diverse and tolerant societies, attracting settlers from various European backgrounds and fostering a mix of agriculture, trade, and nascent industry. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, stood out for its Quaker principles of religious tolerance and peaceful relations with Native Americans, though even these ideals would be challenged by the relentless tide of expansion. The Stuart period in England itself was fraught with internal strife, deeply impacting the colonies. The reigns of James I and his son Charles I were marked by escalating tensions between the Crown and Parliament over issues of power, religion, and finance. This culminated in the English Civil War, 1642-1651, a devastating conflict that tore the nation apart. The colonies, though distant, were not immune, often aligning themselves with either royalist or parliamentarian factions. The execution of Charles III in 1649 and the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell saw a period of Republican rule. Cromwell, though a staunch Puritan, was also a pragmatist who understood the importance of naval power and trade. He passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws designed to ensure that all colonial trade benefited England directly, effectively crippling Dutch commercial dominance and strengthening English mercantile control over its growing empire. These acts laid down fundamental principles of imperial economic control that would last for over a century. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660, with Charles II on the throne, brought a return to royal rule but did not fundamentally alter the trajectory of colonial expansion or mercantilist policy. Indeed, colonial growth accelerated under the later Stuarts, with new proprietary colonies like the Carolinas founded and the consolidation of existing territories. The period also saw the rise of powerful trading companies beyond just the East India Company, such as the Hudson's Bay Company, chartered 1670 for fur trading in North America, further extending English commercial reach. By the end of the Stuart era, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, England had firmly established itself as a significant colonial power. A string of permanent settlements stretched along the North American seaboard, immensely wealthy sugar islands flourished in the Caribbean, and trading posts were securing footholds in India and Africa. This expansion was driven by a powerful combination of economic opportunity, religious freedom, and a growing desire for land and resources. However, it was also built on the twin pillars of brutal forced labor and the displacement or extermination of indigenous peoples. The foundational structures of the British Empire, both its opportunities and its profound injustices, were now firmly in place, ready to be expanded upon in the global conflicts of the coming century. The British Isles and the formation of Great Britain, 1603-1707. While English ships were establishing colonies across the Atlantic and negotiating for trade in the East, the very nature of the British state was undergoing its own profound transformation within the island archipelago. The Stuart period, initially marked by the union of crowns, was a century of intense internal struggle, civil war, religious upheaval, and ultimately the forging of a more permanent political union that would define Great Britain and underpin its future imperial might. Understanding this internal evolution is crucial, for a strong, unified home base was essential for projecting power globally. When James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne in 1603, becoming James I of England, he brought with him the concept of a united Great Britain. He envisioned a single kingdom, free from the historical animosities that had often seen Scotland ally with England's enemies, particularly France. However, this was a union of crowns, not of parliaments or laws. England and Scotland retained their separate legal systems, churches, Anglican in England, Presbyterian in Scotland, and distinct national identities. James's attempts to impose greater religious uniformity and royal authority often met with fierce resistance, particularly in Scotland. His reign, and even more so that of his son Charles I, was characterized by growing friction between the monarch and the English Parliament, rooted in differing views on royal prerogative, taxation, and religion. This escalating tension culminated in the English Civil War, 1642–1651. It was a multifaceted conflict, a power struggle between king and parliament, a religious war between Anglicans and Puritans, and a social struggle that drew in various factions across society. The war ravaged England, Scotland, and Ireland, leading to immense loss of life and profound social dislocation. The defeat and execution of Charles I in 1649, and the establishment of the Commonwealth, a republican government, followed by the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, saw a period of republican rule. Cromwell, though a staunch Puritan, imposed a strict regime and brutally suppressed royalist uprisings, particularly in Ireland. His campaigns in Ireland were devastating, leading to widespread confiscation of Catholic lands and immense suffering, the effects of which resonate to this day. This was a dark chapter of brutal subjugation within the future United Kingdom. Despite the internal turmoil, the Cromwellian period paradoxically strengthened England's naval power and commercial ambitions. The Navigation Acts, passed in 1651, were revolutionary in their mercantilist intent, mandating that all goods imported into England or its colonies must be carried on English ships or ships of the producing country. This was a direct challenge to Dutch mercantile dominance and fueled the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of fierce naval conflicts that ultimately secured England's position as the leading maritime commercial power. These wars, though costly, provided invaluable experience for the English Navy and merchant marine. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660, with Charles II, brought a return to established order, but the underlying tensions between Crown and Parliament, and between different religious factions, remained. His successor, James II, a Catholic, attempted to restore absolute monarchy and Catholicism, leading to widespread alarm. This culminated in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Parliament, fearing a Catholic dynasty and absolute rule, invited James II's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, to take the throne. James fled, and William and Mary ascended, but only after accepting the Bill of Rights, 1689. This pivotal document severely limited royal power, guaranteed parliamentary supremacy, and established fundamental rights for citizens. It solidified England's position as a constitutional monarchy, a model that would later influence imperial governance in varying degrees. While England was solidifying its internal structure, its relationship with Scotland remained distinct. The Scottish economy, unlike England's rapidly expanding colonial trade, struggled. The disastrous Darien Scheme, 1698–1700, an attempt by Scotland to establish its own trading colony in Panama, failed spectacularly due to disease, Spanish aggression, and lack of English support, bankrupting many Scottish investors. This financial catastrophe, combined with England's strategic desire for a unified, secure northern border against potential French threats, created the impetus for a full political union. The Acts of Union of 1707 formally united the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into a single Kingdom of Great Britain with a single Parliament in Westminster. Scotland retained its distinct legal system, its Presbyterian Church, and its own educational system, but its economy, Its military and its foreign policy were now integrated with England's. This union, though controversial and often resisted in Scotland, created a powerful unified state. It brought Scottish resources, manpower, and intellectual vigor into the fold of what was becoming a truly global power. By 1707, Great Britain was no longer a collection of disparate kingdoms. It was a single, increasingly powerful state. It had endured civil war, religious upheaval, and constitutional revolution, emerging with a stronger parliament, a powerful navy, and a unified home front. This internal consolidation, born from centuries of struggle, was the essential precondition for the next phase of empire, one driven by intense European rivalries and the relentless pursuit of global commercial and territorial dominance. The British Empire was now truly beginning to take shape. The East India Company's ascendance, c. 1600, 1757. While the early English colonial endeavors were primarily focused on the Americas, a very different kind of imperial enterprise was taking root thousands of miles away, on the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, began as a relatively modest trading venture, driven by the lucrative spice trade. Yet, over the next century and a half, through a complex interplay of commerce, diplomacy, and cunning military strategy, it would transform itself from a mere commercial entity into the de facto sovereign power over vast swathes of India, a transformation that laid the groundwork for Britain's most prized imperial possession. When the East India Company, EIC, received its charter, its initial rivals were the established Portuguese and, more formidable, the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, was far larger and more powerful, dominating the Spice Islands of Indonesia. The English EIC, unable to dislodge the Dutch from the most lucrative spice routes, turned its attention to the Indian mainland, seeking textiles, cotton and silk, indigo, saltpeter for gunpowder, and eventually tea. India at this time was dominated by the mighty Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated empires in the world. The Mughals were initially tolerant of European traders, granting them permission to establish factories, fortified trading posts, in coastal areas like Surat, Madras, Chennai, Bombay, Mumbai, and Calcutta, Kolkata. The EIC's early strategy was one of respectful commerce, operating at the pleasure of the Mughal emperors, who saw the Europeans primarily as minor trading partners. Throughout the 17th century, the EIC gradually expanded its network of trading posts, fortified them, and developed a robust commercial infrastructure. It brought English goods to India, but more importantly, it shipped Indian textiles, silks, and other commodities to Europe, creating immense profits for its shareholders. The company employed a small number of factors, agents, clerks, and soldiers to protect its interests. Its focus was exclusively on trade, not territorial conquest. However, the political landscape of India began to shift dramatically in the early 18th century. The centralized power of the Mughal Empire began to decline, weakened by succession struggles, internal rebellions, and the rise of powerful regional states, Nawabs, Marathas, Sikhs. This created a power vacuum and increasing instability, which the European trading companies, including the British, French, and Dutch, began to exploit. The primary European rival to the British EIC in India became the French East India Company, Compagnie Française pour le Commerce des Indes Orientales. Both companies began to build stronger fortifications, maintain larger private armies, often composed of Indian sepoys trained in European methods, and interfere in local politics, backing rival Indian rulers in exchange for trading concessions and political influence. This marked a dangerous escalation from purely commercial activities to military and political intervention. The mid-18th century saw the simmering rivalry erupt into open conflict. The War of the Austrian Succession in Europe, 1740-1748, spilled over into India as the First Carnatic War. Then the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763 in Europe, triggered the Third Carnatic War in India. These wars were fought between the British and French companies and their respective Indian allies, often with devastating consequences for the Indian populations caught in the crossfire. The turning point came in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. This was not a grand battle in the traditional sense, but a pivotal moment of treachery and calculated risk. Robert Clive, a brilliant but ruthless EIC officer, faced the vastly larger army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, a powerful and wealthy province. Through a conspiracy with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's disillusioned commander, Clive secured a decisive victory with minimal British casualties. The Battle of Plassey was a game-changer. It effectively gave the East India Company control over Bengal, one of India's richest regions. This was no longer just about trade, it was about territorial rule, revenue collection, and political dominance. Plassey marked the true beginning of the British Empire in India, shifting the EIC's role from mere trader to colonial administrator and military power. The wealth of Bengal began to flow into company coffers, funding further military expansion and enriching private individuals within the company. The immediate aftermath of Plassey saw rampant corruption and exploitation within Bengal, known as the Plassey Plunder. Company officials enriched themselves immensely, devastating the local economy and contributing to famines. This period, while undeniably profitable for Britain, initiated a dark chapter of colonial exploitation and misrule that would eventually lead to greater crown oversight. But there was no turning back. The East India Company, once a small band of merchants, now stood poised to become an empire within an empire, destined to shape the future of India and profoundly impact the trajectory of the entire British global dominion. Competition and conflict. Wars for global dominance. 1688-1763. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent Acts of Union of 1707 created a more stable and powerful British state, ready to assert itself on the world stage. From the late 17th century through the mid-18th century, Britain found itself locked in a relentless series of global conflicts with its European rivals, primarily France. These were not merely European wars. They were wars for global dominance, fought across continents and oceans, and they fundamentally shaped the future of the British Empire, consolidating its territories and establishing its maritime supremacy. The initial series of conflicts were often dubbed Second Hundred Years' War due to their sporadic but persistent nature. It began with the War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, known in North America as King William's War. This was followed by the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, or Queen Anne's War, triggered by the question of who would inherit the Spanish throne. These wars were complex, involving intricate European alliances and battles on land and sea. For Britain, these early conflicts established a crucial pattern: their reliance on naval power and their use of financial strength to subsidize continental allies, allowing them to focus on securing colonial possessions and trade routes. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, was a significant victory for Britain. It secured the strategic territories of Gibraltar and Minorca, commanding the Mediterranean, and crucially, granted Britain the asiento, the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish-American colonies, a chilling testament to the economic importance of the slave trade. It also confirmed British claims in North America, including Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. After a period of relative peace, renewed tensions erupted into the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739-1748. Ostensibly over a Spanish Coast Guard officer cutting off a British captain's ear, but truly a proxy war for trade dominance in the Caribbean and Spanish America. This merged into the larger War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, known as King George's War in North America. These conflicts saw continued skirmishes for control of trading posts, resources, and strategic territories in the colonies. However, the most decisive conflict and the true turning point for British global dominance was the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. Known in North America as the French and Indian War, this was arguably the first true world war, fought across 5 continents and 3 oceans. It pitted Britain and its allies, Prussia, Portugal, against France and its allies, Austria, Russia, Spain. The stakes were immense: control over vast colonial territories in North America, supremacy in the lucrative trade of India, and dominance over global maritime commerce. Britain's strategy, heavily influenced by Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, focused on using its naval supremacy to cripple French trade and seize French colonies, while subsidizing Prussia to tie down French forces in Europe. In North America, the French and Indian War saw fierce fighting between British and French forces, often allied with various Native American tribes. Initial French successes gave way to British triumphs, notably the capture of Louisbourg, 1758, Quebec, 1759, and Montreal, 1760. The capture of Quebec, in particular, under James Wolfe, was a monumental victory that effectively ended French power in mainland North America. In India, as discussed, the 7 Years' War directly led to the Third Carnatic War and the decisive Battle of Plassey, 1757. This saw the British East India Company under Robert Clive emerge victorious over its French counterpart and their Indian allies, effectively neutralizing French influence in India and establishing British dominance over Bengal, a region of immense wealth. Naval battles raged across the world, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, with Britain consistently asserting its maritime superiority. The British Navy, now honed by decades of conflict and fueled by a burgeoning commercial empire, proved decisive in blockading French ports, protecting its own trade routes, and enabling colonial conquests. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, formally ended the 7 Years' War and was a triumph for Great Britain. France ceded virtually all its North American territories east of the Mississippi to Britain, including Canada. Spain, a late entrant, ceded Florida to Britain, receiving Louisiana from France in compensation. In India, France was allowed to retain only a few small trading posts, effectively ending its imperial ambitions there. The 7 Years' War fundamentally reshaped the global balance of power. Britain emerged as the undisputed dominant colonial and maritime power in the world. It had a vast North American empire, growing control over India, and unparalleled naval supremacy. The cost, however, was immense, leading to a greatly increased national debt. This financial burden, coupled with the new administrative challenges of managing such a vast empire, would soon lead to unforeseen consequences and the next major crisis. The very scale of British triumph contained the seeds of future challenges. The American Revolution and the loss of the 13 colonies, 1763-1783. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the pinnacle of Britain's first empire. Vast territories in North America, undisputed control over India, and mastery of the seas seemed to guarantee an era of unparalleled prosperity and power. Yet, within a mere 12 years of this triumph, the very heart of this empire, its prosperous North American colonies, would erupt in rebellion, leading to a catastrophic loss that would fundamentally reshape Britain's imperial strategy. This was the American Revolution, a watershed moment that forced Britain to reassess its relationship with its colonies and, paradoxically, paved the way for a more diverse and global Second Empire. The roots of the American Revolution were complex, growing from decades of evolving relationships between Britain and its 13 mainland North American colonies. For much of the 17th and early 18th centuries, a policy of salutary neglect had prevailed. Britain largely allowed the colonies a degree of self-governance, focusing instead on the lucrative mercantilist trade that tied them economically to the mother country. Colonial assemblies gained significant power, and a distinct American identity began to emerge, rooted in ideas of self-reliance and local control. However, the immense cost of the 7 Years' War, which had directly benefited the American colonists by removing the French threat, left Britain with a staggering national debt. The British government, under Prime Minister George Grenville, believed it was only fair that the colonists contribute to the defense and administration of the empire. This shift marked an end to salutary neglect and the beginning of a more assertive imperial policy aimed at increasing revenue and tightening control. The first major grievance arose with the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a direct tax on various printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. This was unprecedented. While Parliament had long regulated colonial trade, direct internal taxation for revenue was seen by many colonists as a violation of their fundamental rights as Englishmen, specifically the principle of no taxation without representation. The colonists argued that since they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. Widespread protests, boycotts of British goods, and the convening of the Stamp Act Congress forced Parliament to repeal the Act in 1766. However, the repeal was accompanied by the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's full authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever. This laid bare the fundamental constitutional disagreement. Britain asserted absolute parliamentary sovereignty. The colonists asserted local autonomy and rights. Over the next decade, a series of British measures, the Townshend Acts, 1767, the Tea Act, 1773, and the Intolerable Acts, 1774, each provoked further colonial resistance. Events like the Boston Massacre, 1770, where British soldiers fired on a civilian crowd, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773, where colonists destroyed tea to protest the Tea Act, escalated the crisis from political dispute to overt confrontation. British responses, particularly the punitive Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, curtailing Massachusetts' self-governance, only solidified colonial unity. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774, signaling a united front. The philosophical arguments, heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu, emphasized natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the right to revolution when government became tyrannical. These ideas were articulated powerfully by figures like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. The first shots of the war were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, a skirmish that rapidly escalated into full-scale war. The colonists, initially fighting for their rights as Englishmen, quickly moved towards complete independence. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, formally severing ties with Britain and articulating a revolutionary vision of self-government based on universal rights. The Revolutionary War was a long and arduous struggle. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced the formidable might of the British Army, augmented by Hessian mercenaries and loyalist forces. However, the colonists benefited from fighting on home ground, a deep commitment to their cause, and crucially, strategic blunders by British commanders who often underestimated the resolve of the rebels. A pivotal moment came with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, a decisive American victory that persuaded France, Britain's long-standing rival, to formally enter the war as an American ally. French financial aid, naval support, and military assistance, including troops and commanders like Lafayette, proved invaluable, turning the tide against Britain and transforming the conflict into a global war once more. Spain and the Netherlands also joined the fray against Britain, further straining British resources. The war culminated in the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where a combined American and French force trapped a large British army under General Cornwallis, forcing his surrender. This decisive defeat, coupled with growing war weariness and financial strain in Britain, led to the collapse of the British government and the decision to seek peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the independence of the United States of America, granting them vast territories west to the Mississippi River. It was a humiliating blow to British prestige and a shocking loss of what had been its most populous and economically valuable colonies. The loss of the 13 colonies forced Britain to confront its own imperial strategies. It signaled that a new model of empire might be necessary, one that relied less on direct control and more on trade and naval supremacy. Paradoxically, the loss of the American colonies did not signal the end of the British Empire, but rather a reorientation. The attention of British imperialists would now shift eastward, towards the burgeoning territories in India, towards the penal colonies of Australia, and towards a new era of expansion driven by the Industrial Revolution. The American Revolution, though a devastating defeat for Britain, ironically provided crucial lessons that would inform the development of its Second Empire, one built on different principles, with new challenges and new opportunities. The lessons were harsh, but they forged a more adaptive and resilient imperial power. India from company rule to crown control, 1757–1858. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 had established the British East India Company as a powerful political force in Bengal. Yet this was merely the first domino in a century-long process that would see a private trading company morph into the de facto sovereign power over vast swathes of India, leading eventually to direct British crown control over India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. This transformation was marked by a relentless pursuit of power, often brutal conquest, and profound, lasting impacts on Indian society. Following Plassey, the East India Company, EIC, became the master of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. This gave the company access to immense revenues, which it used not just for trade, but, crucially, to fund its ever-growing private army. This army, composed largely of Indian sepoys trained and commanded by British officers, became the most formidable military force on the subcontinent. The company's directors in London, initially focused on profit, increasingly found themselves managing a vast territorial empire. The late 18th century was characterized by a period of aggressive expansion and ruthless consolidation under figures like Warren Hastings and Lord Cornwallis. Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal, faced immense challenges: internal corruption, external threats from powerful Indian states like Mysore and the Marathas, and the complexities of administering a vast population. His rule, though often controversial and leading to an impeachment trial in Britain, laid many of the administrative foundations for company rule. The company's expansion was not unopposed. Powerful Indian states and confederacies fought fiercely to resist British encroachment. The Anglo-Mysore Wars, particularly against Tipu Sultan, known as the Tiger of Mysore, and the Anglo-Maratha Wars, against the formidable Maratha Confederacy, were protracted and bloody conflicts. These wars saw British military power, combined with sophisticated diplomacy and economic leverage, gradually dismantle the major Indian states, one by one. By the turn of the 19th century, under governors-general like Lord Wellesley, the policy shifted from mere paramountcy, supreme power, to direct annexation and the imposition of subsidiary alliances, where Indian rulers retained nominal sovereignty but effectively surrendered control over their foreign policy and military to the company. This system created a vast network of dependent states, further solidifying company rule. The company's administration brought significant changes. It introduced a new legal system based on English common law, established a civil service, the Indian Civil Service, and built infrastructure like roads, canals, and later railways and telegraph lines. These changes, often introduced with the stated aim of improving India, were primarily designed to facilitate British administration trade, and military control. However, these changes came at a severe social and economic cost. Traditional industries like textiles were undermined by the influx of cheaper British manufactured goods. Revenue collection systems often led to indebtedness and land displacement for Indian farmers. The company's cultural insensitivity, its efforts at westernization, e.g., suppression of sati, introduction of English education, and the aggressive proselytization by Christian missionaries caused increasing resentment among both Hindu and Muslim populations. The flashpoint for this simmering resentment was the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, or India's First War of Independence. It began as a revolt among Indian sepoys of the EIC Army, triggered by controversies over new rifle cartridges greased with animal fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, and deeper grievances about disrespect for religious practices, perceived British arrogance, and annexation policies. The rebellion quickly spread across northern India, involving not just sepoys, but also dispossessed princes, landowners, and ordinary people. It was a brutal and bloody conflict, marked by massacres on both sides, e.g., Kanpur, Lucknow. The British response was equally brutal, involving widespread reprisals and the suppression of the rebellion with overwhelming force. The Indian Rebellion was ultimately crushed, but its consequences were immense. It shocked the British establishment and highlighted the precariousness of company rule. The British government, no longer willing to trust a private company with the governance of such a vital territory, passed the Government of India Act of 1858. This landmark act abolished the East India Company and transferred direct control of India to the British Crown. India was now directly governed by the British Parliament, administered by a Secretary of State for India in London and a Viceroy in India. This marked the formal beginning of the British Raj. The transformation from commercial venture to full-blown imperial dominion was complete. The jewel in the crown was now formally acquired, ready to be exploited for its resources, its markets, and its immense strategic value, and to become a symbol of Britain's global power and prestige for the next 90 years. The lessons of the rebellion would shape British policy in India for decades, leading to administrative reforms and a more cautious approach to social intervention, but cementing direct imperial rule. The Napoleonic Wars and Global Hegemony, 1792-1815. Even as Britain grappled with the loss of its American colonies and consolidated its power in India, a new and existential threat emerged from continental Europe: revolutionary France, led by the military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803-1815, following the French Revolutionary Wars from 1792, were not merely European conflicts. They were global struggles for ideological supremacy and imperial dominance. Britain, as the leading maritime and industrial power, played a singular and decisive role, ultimately emerging from the maelstrom as the undisputed global hegemon, setting the stage for the Pax Britannica. The French Revolution of 1789 profoundly disturbed the established order of Europe. Its republican ideals and the execution of King Louis XVI sent shockwaves through monarchical Europe. Britain, wary of revolutionary fervor and deeply concerned by French expansionism, quickly became a leading member of various coalitions formed to contain France. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte from revolutionary general to first consul and then emperor fundamentally escalated the conflict. Napoleon was not just a military commander. He was a strategic visionary who sought to establish French dominion over Europe and challenge British global power, primarily through economic warfare and direct invasion. For Britain, the war was fought on two fronts: financially by subsidizing continental allies to tie down French armies, and militarily by leveraging its naval supremacy to protect its trade routes, blockade French ports, and seize French and Allied colonies. This was a war of economic attrition as much as military might. The pivotal figure in Britain's naval strategy was Horatio Nelson. His daring tactics and strategic brilliance cemented British naval supremacy. The Battle of the Nile, 1798, crippled Napoleon's ambitions in Egypt and the Middle East, but it was the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, that secured Britain's global maritime dominance for the next century. Nelson's decisive victory over the combined French and Spanish fleets off the coast of Spain annihilated Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain and established the Royal Navy as the unchallenged force on the world's oceans. With direct invasion thwarted, Napoleon resorted to economic warfare, implementing the Continental System, a large-scale embargo against British trade throughout Europe. However, Britain countered with its own blockades, and its vast global trade network, particularly with its growing empire, allowed it to weather the economic storm, while the Continental System ultimately harmed France and its allies more. On land, Britain largely focused on its own colonial interests and the Peninsular War, 1808-1814, in Spain and Portugal. Here, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, rose to prominence. Leading British and Portuguese forces, Wellington systematically defeated French armies in the Iberian Peninsula, tying down vast numbers of Napoleon's troops and providing a crucial running sore for the French emperor. The Peninsular War was crucial because it demonstrated that French land power was not invincible and provided a training ground for a new generation of British military leaders and soldiers. Meanwhile, Britain also seized numerous French, Dutch, and Spanish colonies throughout the conflict, including territories in the Caribbean, like Trinidad, the Cape Colony in South Africa, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka. These acquisitions, often strategic outposts, further solidified Britain's global reach. The ultimate defeat of Napoleon came in 1815, first with his disastrous Russian campaign, and then with his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, where Wellington, commanding a combined Allied army, decisively routed Napoleon's forces. The Congress of Vienna, 1815, which followed Napoleon's defeat, reshaped the map of Europe and established a new international order. Britain emerged from these wars as the undisputed global superpower. Its naval supremacy was unchallenged, its colonial empire had expanded significantly, and its financial system had proven remarkably resilient. This period ushered in the Pax Britannica, a century of relative peace and global order enforced by British naval power and economic dominance. Free trade, championed by Britain, began to replace mercantilism as the prevailing economic philosophy. The Industrial Revolution, rapidly gaining pace in Britain, would further fuel this dominance, creating an insatiable demand for raw materials from its empire and new markets for its manufactured goods. The defeat of Napoleon had not just secured Britain's safety, it had set the stage for its undisputed global hegemony for the rest of the 19th century, a period of unprecedented imperial expansion and influence. Abolitionism and shifting morality, late 18th, mid-19th century. Even as the British Empire expanded its reach and solidified its global dominance, a powerful and transformative moral movement was gaining momentum within Britain itself, the abolitionist movement. The institution of slavery, which had fueled the immense wealth of the Caribbean sugar colonies for centuries, was increasingly seen by a growing segment of British society as a moral abomination. This shift in public conscience would lead to one of the most significant moral undertakings in imperial history: the abolition of the slave trade and, eventually, slavery itself throughout the British Empire. The transatlantic slave trade had been a cornerstone of the British Empire's early economic success. British merchants and slave traders, particularly from ports like Liverpool and Bristol, had amassed immense fortunes transporting millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work in the brutal conditions of the West Indian sugar plantations. This trade provided crucial capital for the Industrial Revolution and fueled the growth of numerous industries in Britain. However, from the mid-18th century, voices of dissent began to emerge. Early criticisms came from religious groups, particularly Quakers, who viewed slavery as fundamentally incompatible with Christian principles. Enlightenment thinkers in both Britain and its American colonies also began to question the morality of human bondage, emphasizing concepts of natural rights and individual liberty. The abolitionist movement gained significant momentum in the late 18th century, becoming a truly mass movement. Key figures like William Wilberforce, a tireless evangelical politician, and Thomas Clarkson, a relentless researcher and organizer, played pivotal roles. They worked to expose the horrors of the Middle Passage and the brutal realities of plantation life, gathering evidence and presenting compelling arguments to Parliament and the public. The abolitionists employed innovative campaign methods, including mass petitions, public lectures, boycotts of slave-produced sugar, and powerful testimonies from former slaves like Olaudah Equiano. Their efforts successfully raised public awareness and put immense pressure on Parliament. Despite fierce opposition from powerful West Indian sugar planters and vested commercial interests, the movement achieved its first major victory in 1807 when the British Parliament passed the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. This act outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, making it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved people. This was a momentous achievement, but it did not abolish slavery itself. It merely stopped the supply of new slaves. Even after 1807, British naval squadrons, particularly the West Africa Squadron, actively patrolled the Atlantic to enforce the ban, intercepting slave ships of various nationalities. This marked a unique instance of a former leading slaving nation now actively working to suppress the trade, though often for mixed motives, including asserting naval power. However, slavery continued to flourish in the British colonies, particularly in the West Indies, where the enslaved population suffered under horrific conditions. The abolitionist campaign, reinvigorated by figures like Elizabeth Herrick and Mary Prince, continued its fight for full emancipation. Economic arguments also played a role. As Britain's industrial base grew, the perceived economic benefits of slavery began to wane compared to the potential of free labor and new markets. Finally, in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. This was a truly transformative piece of legislation. It granted freedom to all enslaved people in the colonies, though it came with a significant caveat. Slave owners were compensated for their loss of property with a staggering $20 million, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to about 40% of the national budget, while the formerly enslaved received no compensation. This debt would burden British taxpayers for generations. The abolition of slavery was a landmark moral achievement for the British Empire, showcasing a capacity for self-correction and a response to evolving humanitarian ideals. It solidified Britain's image as a leading moral force, a powerful narrative it would later use to justify further imperial expansion as a civilizing mission. However, it also left a complex legacy. The vast sums paid to slave owners highlighted the immense profits derived from slavery and the enduring economic privilege of its beneficiaries. The social and economic challenges faced by the newly freed populations in the West Indies, without land or compensation, were immense and contributed to long-term inequalities. The abolitionist movement demonstrated the growing power of public opinion and moral advocacy in shaping imperial policy. It marked a significant shift in Britain's imperial self-perception, moving away from purely commercial exploitation towards a more paternalistic, civilizing rationale for empire, even as other forms of exploitation continued. Australasia and South Africa, penal colonies and resource exploitation, late 18th, mid-19th century. As Britain reeled from the loss of its American colonies and fought for its life against Napoleon, its imperial gaze sought new horizons. The vast, mysterious lands of Australasia and the strategically vital Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa offered solutions to new imperial challenges, a destination for its overflowing convict population, and new opportunities for trade, resources, and strategic control. These regions, far removed from the centers of imperial power, would become crucial components of the Second British Empire, shaped by unique motivations and often brutal encounters with indigenous populations. The initial impetus for British settlement in Australia was not grand imperial ambition, but rather a pragmatic solution to a pressing domestic problem. A burgeoning prison population after the American Revolution closed off the traditional outlet for convicts. In 1788, the first fleet, carrying around 750 convicts, landed at Sydney Cove, establishing the first penal colony in New South Wales. This marked the beginning of a unique form of colonization, driven initially by punitive measures rather than purely economic gain. Life in the early penal colonies was incredibly harsh. Convicts, often serving long sentences for minor offenses, were forced into grueling labor, building infrastructure and developing agricultural land. Over time, free settlers also arrived, lured by the promise of land and opportunity, gradually transforming the penal settlements into more conventional colonies. The discovery of gold in the mid-19th century would dramatically accelerate this transformation, sparking massive immigration and rapid development. Simultaneously, the colonization of New Zealand began. While early contact involved whalers, sealers, and missionaries, British interest escalated with the influx of European settlers. Concerns about lawlessness and the desire to protect the indigenous Maori people from unscrupulous European exploitation led to the formal assertion of British sovereignty. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 between representatives of the British Crown and various Maori chiefs, ceded sovereignty to Britain while ostensibly guaranteeing Maori land rights and chieftainship. However, the interpretation and implementation of the Treaty of Waitangi would become a source of immense conflict, leading to the New Zealand Wars, or Maori Wars, from the 1840s to the 1870s. These were brutal conflicts over land and sovereignty, where British forces fought against determined Maori resistance. Despite the eventual imposition of British control, the Maori managed to retain a stronger sense of cultural identity and some land compared to many other indigenous populations under British rule. In southern Africa, British involvement had a different genesis. The Cape Colony, established by the Dutch East India Company in the mid-17th century, was a crucial strategic point on the trade route to India. Britain, seeking to secure this vital maritime link, seized the colony from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, initially in 1795, permanently in 1806. The British acquisition of the Cape brought them into direct contact with the existing Boer Dutch settler population, who had developed a distinct agrarian culture and held deeply conservative views, including a reliance on slave labor. British anti-slavery policies and administrative changes caused deep resentment among the Boers, leading to the Great Trek in the 1830s. Thousands of Boers migrated inland, seeking to escape British rule and establish independent republics like the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Beyond the Boers, Britain's expansion in southern Africa led to profound and often devastating encounters with the powerful indigenous African kingdoms, notably the Zulu Empire. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, though technically outside this period, was a dramatic manifestation of the conflict that would emerge from British expansion, as Britain sought to consolidate its control over the resource-rich interior and secure its strategic interests. The mid-19th century saw the British presence in Australasia and South Africa solidify. These colonies, driven by diverse motivations, penal reform, strategic necessity, and later resource exploitation, wool in Australia, diamonds, and gold in South Africa, represented a new frontier for the British Empire. They were often settler colonies, where European populations eventually outnumbered or dominated the indigenous inhabitants, leading to complex and often tragic histories of displacement, conflict, and cultural suppression. Yet, they also contributed immense wealth and strategic depth to an empire that was constantly adapting to new global challenges and opportunities. Industrial Revolution and Imperial Power, mid-19th century. The mid-19th century witnessed a profound shift in Britain's imperial trajectory, driven by the seismic transformations of the Industrial Revolution. This was the era of the Pax Britannica, a period of unparalleled British global hegemony, where its empire became larger, richer, and more deeply integrated than ever before. The technological innovations, economic might, and social changes wrought by industrialization were not merely coincidental to imperial expansion. They were its primary engine, providing the means, the motive, and the justification for Britain's dominion over a quarter of the globe. Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, a process beginning in the late 18th century and accelerating dramatically through the 19th. Innovations in textile production, spinning jenny power loom, the development of the steam engine, and advancements in iron and steel production created an unprecedented capacity for manufacturing. This industrial prowess fundamentally altered Britain's economic needs and capabilities. The ravenous appetite of British industry for raw materials was a key driver of imperial expansion. Factories needed vast quantities of cotton for textiles, rubber for new manufacturing processes, timber, minerals, and later oil. Many of these resources were either found within the empire or controlled through imperial trade networks. Colonies became vital suppliers, ensuring a steady, cheap, and controlled flow of essential commodities. Conversely, Britain's industrial output created an equally pressing need for markets. With its factories producing goods at an ever-increasing rate, Britain needed vast populations to buy its manufactured textiles, machinery, and consumer goods. The empire provided precisely this: captive markets protected by imperial tariffs and administrative structures, absorbing British exports and further fueling industrial growth. This symbiotic relationship between industrial production and imperial consumption was central to the mid-Victorian Empire. Technological advancements facilitated the expansion and control of this vast empire. Steam power revolutionized transportation. Steamships drastically cut travel times, making it possible to deploy troops, administrators, and goods more rapidly across oceans. This naval superiority, fueled by steam and later steel, underpinned the Pax Britannica. On land, the development of railways in India, Canada, and Africa allowed for rapid movement of troops, goods, and resources within vast territories, consolidating administrative control and opening up interiors for exploitation. The telegraph, invented in the mid-19th century, enabled instantaneous communication between London and distant parts of the empire, allowing for centralized command and control like never before. The Industrial Revolution also provided Britain with a military edge. Advanced weaponry, from more accurate rifles to increasingly powerful artillery, along with sophisticated logistical capabilities, made it easier for relatively small British forces to subjugate and control much larger indigenous populations. This technological superiority was a key factor in the rapid expansion during the scramble for Africa and other regions. Moreover, the Industrial Revolution provided a new ideological justification for empire. British industrialists and politicians increasingly believed that Britain had a moral duty to bring the benefits of industrialization, commerce, and civilization to the backward parts of the world. This idea of a civilizing mission, often intertwined with Christian missionary efforts, provided a powerful, if self-serving, rationale for continued expansion and intervention. The economic strength derived from industrialization also allowed Britain to invest heavily in its imperial infrastructure and administration. From the construction of railways in India to ports in Singapore and administrative buildings in colonial capitals, the physical manifestation of empire was a direct product of Britain's industrial wealth. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire was no longer just a collection of distant settlements. It was a vast, integrated global system, economically and technologically driven by the engines of the Industrial Revolution. This intricate web of trade, communication, and control, enforced by the Royal Navy, created the Pax Britannica, an era where British power shaped global affairs to an unprecedented degree. This era of prosperity and unchallenged dominance set the stage for the intense period of high imperialism that would define the late 19th century. The Scramble for Africa, c. 1870-1914. By the late 19th century, the British Empire, already vast, embarked on its final and most dramatic surge of expansion, the Scramble for Africa. This period, roughly from the 1870s to the outbreak of World War I, saw the rapid and often brutal partitioning of almost the entire African continent among European powers. For Britain, it was a race for resources, strategic advantage, and prestige, cementing its position as the largest empire the world had ever seen, but leaving a profound and often devastating legacy for the African peoples. Africa, a continent of immense natural wealth and diverse cultures, had long been known to Europeans primarily through coastal trading posts and the transatlantic slave trade. But by the latter half of the 19th century, a confluence of factors ignited a frenzied rush to claim its interior. These included Europe's insatiable demand for raw materials, rubber, diamonds, gold, copper, palm oil, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, the rise of intense European rivalries, and the development of new technologies that made deep penetration of the continent possible. The motivations behind the scramble were multifaceted. Economic interests were paramount, driven by the need for new markets and raw materials. Strategic imperatives were also crucial, as powers sought to secure naval bases, coaling stations, and control over vital waterways like the Suez Canal. Though acquired earlier by Britain, it became a key strategic point. National prestige and competition played a huge role. No European power wanted to be left out of the race, leading to a sense of urgency and rivalry. Underlying it all was the pervasive ideology of social Darwinism and the civilizing mission, which posited that Europeans had a duty to civilize and Christianize the supposedly backward peoples of Africa, often used to justify exploitation. Britain, already the dominant global power, initially hesitated to engage in a full-scale territorial scramble. However, as other European powers, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, began to stake their claims, Britain was drawn in, primarily to protect its existing interests and prevent rivals from gaining too much advantage. Key figures like Cecil Rhodes, a ruthless diamond magnate, epitomized the drive for British expansion in southern Africa, dreaming of a railway line from Cape to Cairo under British control. The informal rules of the scramble were largely formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. Convened by Otto von Bismarck of Germany, this conference saw European powers carve up Africa on paper, often without any regard for existing ethnic or linguistic boundaries. The principle of effective occupation was established, meaning that a claim to territory had to be backed by actual presence and administration, spurring a further rush to establish control. Britain acquired vast territories. In West Africa, it consolidated control over colonies like Nigeria, Ghana, Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone, driven by palm oil, cocoa, and rubber. In East Africa, it established the East Africa Protectorate, Kenya, and Uganda, primarily for strategic control of the Nile headwaters and a potential route to India. In southern Africa, the conquest of the Zulu Kingdom, 1879, and crucially the eventual victory in the Anglo-Boer Wars, 1899-1902, against the Dutch-descended settlers, solidified British control over the resource-rich regions of South Africa. The Anglo-Boer Wars were particularly costly and controversial. Fought between the British Empire and the Boer republics, Orange Free State and Transvaal, they were driven by British desires for control over the Witwatersrand gold mines and a unified South Africa. The war was brutal, characterized by guerrilla tactics, scorched earth policies, and the notorious use of concentration camps by the British, which resulted in tens of thousands of Boer women and children and even more African civilians dying from disease and starvation. This conflict exposed the darker side of imperial expansion and sparked considerable international criticism. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain's African empire was immense, spanning from Egypt in the north to the Cape in the south, and significant territories in West and East Africa. It was a mosaic of protectorates, colonies, and self-governing dominions, like the Union of South Africa formed in 1910. This rapid acquisition of territory brought new administrative challenges and exposed Britain to new forms of resistance. The legacy of the scramble for Africa is profound and enduring. It redrew the map of an entire continent, imposing artificial borders that cut across ethnic and cultural lines, contributing to future conflicts. It led to the systematic exploitation of African resources and labor, disrupting traditional societies and economies. While Britain justified its actions as bringing civilization, the reality for many Africans was one of subjugation, economic hardship, and the loss of sovereignty. The scramble for Africa represented the peak of territorial imperialism, a testament to Britain's power, but also a stark reminder of the human cost of global dominance. Imperial administration and ideology, mid-19th, early 20th century. Managing an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe required an unprecedented level of administrative sophistication. During the era of high imperialism, Britain developed a complex and evolving system of governance for its diverse territories, underpinned by powerful ideologies that both justified and shaped its rule. From the corridors of Westminster to the remote outposts of the empire, a distinct imperial culture emerged, designed to maintain control, extract resources, and implement the civilizing mission. The administrative structures of the British Empire were not monolithic. They varied significantly depending on the type of colony and its strategic or economic importance. Broadly, they fell into several categories. Crown colonies directly governed by the British Crown through appointed governors. Protectorates where local rulers maintained some nominal authority, but British advisors exercised ultimate control. And dominions where white settler colonies gained increasing levels of self-governance. India, as the British Raj, was the ultimate crown colony, governed by a viceroy. The backbone of this administration was the Indian Civil Service, ICS, and similar colonial services in other territories. These elite cadres of British administrators, educated in public schools and Oxbridge, were trained to govern vast populations. They were seen as embodying the best of British character, incorruptible, efficient, and dedicated to the service of the empire. They built infrastructure, managed legal systems, collected taxes, and maintained order, often with a profound sense of paternalism and racial superiority. Underpinning these administrative structures were powerful imperial ideologies. The concept of the civilizing mission was central. Britain saw itself as bringing the benefits of civilization, Christianity, Western education, law, infrastructure, and progress to supposedly backward societies. This often involved the suppression of local customs deemed barbaric and the imposition of British norms. Social Darwinism provided a pseudo-scientific justification for racial hierarchy. It argued that Europeans, particularly Anglo-Saxons, were inherently superior and thus destined to rule over lesser races. This ideology fueled racial segregation, discriminatory laws, and a pervasive sense of white supremacy throughout the empire. The white man's burden, popularized by Rudyard Kipling, captured this sense of duty and the accompanying racial condescension. Education was a key tool of imperial administration. While limited primary education was sometimes provided, the focus for higher education was often on creating a class of educated indigenous elites who could serve as intermediaries within the colonial administration. English became the language of government, law, and commerce, further solidifying British cultural dominance. The military was, of course, the ultimate enforcer of imperial rule. The British Army, particularly its Indian component, and the Royal Navy, provided the muscle to maintain order, suppress rebellions, and project power. The image of the red-coated soldier and the mighty battleship became symbols of British imperial might. By the early 20th century, this administrative and ideological edifice was at its peak. It was efficient, hierarchical, and deeply embedded in the social fabric of both Britain and its colonies. It shaped the lives of millions, bringing both infrastructure and exploitation, order, and profound disruption. It created a global system of governance that, while often benevolent in its self-perception, was fundamentally designed to serve the interests of the imperial power. The empire was not just a collection of territories. It was a complex system of power, culture, and ideas, meticulously administered from London and enforced with a mixture of bureaucracy, ideology, and overwhelming force. Canada and the path to dominion status, mid-19th, early 20th century. While India represented the pinnacle of direct crown rule and the African territories exemplified rapid expansion, Canada offered a different model for the British Empire, a path toward self-governance and the eventual evolution into a dominion. Its story illustrates Britain's pragmatic adaptability in managing settler colonies and foreshadows the future structure of the Commonwealth. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which saw Britain acquire vast French territories in North America, Canada was a complex mosaic. It comprised a substantial French-speaking Catholic population in Quebec, formerly New France, British loyalists who fled the American Revolution, and various indigenous First Nations. Governing this diverse population under British rule was a significant challenge. The Quebec Act of 1774 was an early attempt to address the unique situation of the French-speaking population. It preserved French civil law, freedom of religion for Catholics, and their seigneurial system, helping to prevent a full-scale Canadian rebellion during the American Revolution. However, it also angered the American colonists and Protestant British settlers by effectively expanding Quebec's borders. Following the American Revolution, thousands of Loyalists fled to Canada, primarily to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what became Upper Canada, Ontario. Their presence significantly altered the demographic and political landscape, creating demands for British common law and representative government. To accommodate these diverse groups, the Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Quebec into Upper Canada, predominantly English-speaking with British law, and Lower Canada, predominantly French-speaking, retaining French law and institutions. Both were granted representative assemblies, laying the groundwork for self-governance, but ultimate power remained with British-appointed governors. The War of 1812 between Britain and the United States was a crucial moment for Canadian identity. Despite being a sideshow for Britain fighting Napoleon, the defense of Canada against American invasion fostered a sense of unity among both French and English Canadians against a common external threat, solidifying their allegiance to the British Crown. However, by the 1830s, tensions mounted between the elected assemblies and the appointed governors, leading to demands for responsible government, where the Executive Council would be accountable to the elected assembly, not just the governor. These tensions erupted into the rebellions of 1837 to 38 in both Upper and Lower Canada, led by William Lyon Mackenzie and Louis-Joseph Papineau, respectively. The British government, realizing the need for reform, sent Lord Durham to investigate. His influential Durham Report of 1839 recommended the eventual union of Upper and Lower Canada and, crucially, advocated for responsible government. Durham believed that granting greater autonomy to settler colonies was the best way to maintain their loyalty and prevent further American-style revolutions. The Act of Union of 1840 united Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada, with a single legislature. While responsible government was not immediately granted, it was gradually implemented over the next decade, with the first truly responsible government formed in 1848. This principle, that the colonial government would govern with the confidence of the elected assembly, became a cornerstone for the future of the settler empire. The idea of a larger confederation of British North American colonies gained traction in the mid-19th century, driven by fears of American expansionism, the need for common defense, and the desire for economic integration. Key figures like John A. Macdonald championed the vision of a transcontinental nation. The British North America Act of 1867, later renamed the Constitution Act 1867, formally established the Dominion of Canada, uniting the province of Canada, divided into Ontario and Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, into a federal union. It was a significant step towards full nationhood, granting Canada broad powers over its internal affairs while retaining ties to the British Crown and the Westminster parliamentary system. Over the following decades, other provinces joined the Dominion, and Canada gradually gained more autonomy, establishing its own foreign policy and even contributing troops under its own command in later conflicts. The Canadian model of evolution towards Dominion status became a blueprint for other white settler colonies like Australia, Federation in 1901, New Zealand, Dominion in 1907, and eventually South Africa, Union in 1910. These dominions, while loyal to the Crown, represented a unique and evolving form of imperial relationship, balancing self-governance with imperial unity. Canada's journey demonstrated Britain's capacity for pragmatic adaptation in its imperial strategy. Rather than clinging to rigid direct rule, it learned to foster loyalty and shared interests through autonomy, recognizing that a more flexible approach could preserve the empire's cohesion. This evolving relationship would prove crucial in the crises of the 20th century, as these nascent nations, though increasingly independent, would largely choose to stand with Britain in times of global conflict. Egypt and the Middle East, strategic crossroads, late 19th, early 20th century. As the scramble for Africa intensified and the global economic landscape shifted, Britain's imperial focus broadened to include another region of immense strategic importance, the Middle East and North Africa. Dominated for centuries by the declining Ottoman Empire, this region, particularly Egypt, became a critical crossroads for trade, communications, and access to the vital jewel in the crown, India. Britain's involvement here was less about direct conquest and more about securing vital arteries of empire, often through complex political maneuvering and financial leverage. The primary British interest in the Middle East revolved around the Suez Canal. Completed in 1869, this artificial waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea dramatically shortened the sea route between Europe and Asia, bypassing the long and treacherous journey around the Cape of Good Hope. For Britain, with its vast Indian empire, the canal was an absolutely vital lifeline, reducing journey times to India by thousands of miles and weeks. Initially, the Suez Canal Company was largely French-owned, but in 1875, the British government, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, made a shrewd financial move. Seizing an opportunity, he purchased a controlling stake in the canal company from the financially distressed Khedive, ruler of Egypt. This acquisition gave Britain significant financial and political leverage over the canal, making it a critical strategic asset. Egypt itself, though nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, was increasingly independent but deeply indebted to European banks, primarily British and French. Growing financial instability and nationalist unrest in Egypt provided Britain with the pretext for intervention. In 1882, a nationalist uprising led by Urabi Pasha threatened European interests and the Khedive's rule. Britain, concerned about the security of the Suez Canal and its financial investments, intervened militarily. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir in 1882 resulted in a decisive British victory, and while Britain formally declared its occupation temporary, it effectively established a de facto British protectorate over Egypt. Lord Cromer, as Consul General, became the true power behind the Khedive, overseeing Egyptian administration, finances, and foreign policy, ensuring British control over the canal and a stable supply of Egyptian cotton. This was a classic example of veiled protectorate, imperial control without direct annexation. Beyond Egypt, British interests in the wider Middle East also grew, driven by strategic concerns and, increasingly, the discovery of oil. The region, encompassing the Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Persia, Iran, was a crucial buffer zone for India and lay astride critical land and sea routes. Britain established a strong presence in the Persian Gulf through a series of treaties with local sheikhs, securing naval bases and controlling trade. The declining Ottoman Empire, often referred to as the sick man of Europe, presented both opportunities and challenges. Britain sought to prevent other European powers, especially Russia and Germany, from gaining too much influence in the region while securing its own strategic interests. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP, formed in 1908, became a vital component of British economic and strategic power, securing oil supplies for the Royal Navy, which was transitioning from coal to oil. By the early 20th century, Britain's strategic interests in the Middle East were deeply entrenched. The Suez Canal was a vital artery of empire. Egypt was a key strategic outpost, and the nascent oil industry in Persia promised immense future wealth and energy security for the Royal Navy. This complex web of influence, financial control, and military presence laid the groundwork for Britain's later involvement in the region during and after the World Wars, defining its continued imperial role well into the 20th century. The empire was not just about territory anymore. It was about global networks, strategic choke points, and the security of vital resources. World War I and the strain on empire. 1914-1918. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at its zenith, a colossal entity painted red across the global map. Yet this unprecedented power was about to be tested by a cataclysm of unimaginable scale, the First World War. Far from being a solely European conflict, the Great War profoundly impacted the British Empire, drawing in its vast resources and diverse populations, and ultimately exposing cracks in its seemingly invincible edifice that would accelerate its eventual decline. When war erupted in August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and by extension its entire empire was automatically at war. There was an initial outpouring of loyalty from across the dominions and colonies, driven by a sense of shared British identity, obligation, or the belief that participation would lead to greater autonomy or recognition. For many, it was seen as a chance to prove their loyalty and maturity on the world stage. The contribution of the empire was immense and often overlooked in traditional narratives. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, as dominions, immediately pledged their support, raising large volunteer armies. Their soldiers, often distinct from their British counterparts in demeanor and experience, would fight with extraordinary bravery and suffer immense casualties on the Western Front, at Gallipoli, and in the Middle East. The Canadian Corps at Vimy Ridge, the Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, at Gallipoli, and the South African efforts in German Southwest Africa became defining moments for their nascent national identities forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. Beyond the white dominions, the colonial empire also provided crucial manpower and resources. India made an extraordinary contribution. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers and non-combatants served in various theaters of war, from the brutal trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of Mesopotamia and Egypt. They endured harsh conditions, cultural alienation, and discrimination, but fought with immense courage. Indian princely states also contributed vast sums of money and supplies. African and Caribbean colonies also contributed significantly. Over 1 million African porters and carriers supported campaigns in East Africa and other fronts, often suffering appalling conditions and high mortality rates. Thousands of soldiers from West Indies regiments fought in the Middle East and elsewhere. The empire's diverse populations provided invaluable labor, logistical support, and fighting men, without whom the Allied war effort would have been severely hampered. The war fundamentally altered the relationship between Britain and its empire. The immense human and economic cost placed an unprecedented strain on imperial resources. While the empire proved resilient, its reliance on colonial manpower and wealth was a double-edged sword. Colonial subjects, having fought and died for the empire, returned home with a heightened sense of self-worth, national consciousness, and a growing expectation of greater rights and autonomy. They had witnessed European weakness and internal divisions firsthand, and their loyalty had been proven. Economically, Britain's immense war expenditure, much of it financed by loans from the United States, irrevocably shifted the global financial balance of power away from London. The war also disrupted traditional trade routes, forcing colonies to develop their own industrial capacities and seek new trading partners, weakening the mercantilist ties to Britain. Politically, the war accelerated the rise of nationalist movements. In India, figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who had supported the war effort, returned with a renewed determination to achieve Swaraj, self-rule. The Amritsar massacre in 1919, where British troops fired on unarmed Indian protesters, became a potent symbol of imperial oppression and fueled the independence movement. In the Middle East, the war also opened new imperial opportunities, but created lasting problems. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire led to Britain and France taking control of vast new territories under the League of Nations mandate system. Britain acquired mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Mesopotamia, Iraq, driven by strategic interests, e.g., oil, safeguarding the route to India, but often making conflicting promises, e.g., to Arabs for independence, to Jews for a national home in Palestine. These new acquisitions, while expanding the empire territorially, came with heavy administrative burdens and inherent instability. The First World War did not immediately dismantle the British Empire. Indeed, it expanded its territorial reach with the acquisition of new mandates. However, it profoundly weakened Britain financially, shifted global power dynamics, and most importantly, awakened a potent sense of nationalism and self-determination within the colonies. The sacrifice made by imperial subjects during the war had earned them, in their eyes, the right to a greater say in their own destiny. The war had placed an immense strain on the empire, and while it had survived, the seeds of decolonization had been irrevocably sown. The interwar years would reveal the deepening cracks in the imperial edifice. The interwar period, cracks in the edifice, 1918-1939. The period between the two world wars was a deceptively quiet interlude for the British Empire. Outwardly, it remained immense, its territories stretching across every continent. Yet beneath the surface, profound internal and external pressures were building. The economic strains of the Great War, the rise of powerful nationalist movements, and the emergence of new geopolitical threats exposed significant cracks in the imperial edifice, forcing Britain to confront the evolving nature of its global dominion. The immense human and financial cost of World War I left Britain heavily indebted and economically exhausted. While the empire had provided critical resources, maintaining such a vast network of territories proved increasingly expensive. The economic policies of the interwar period, including the return to the gold standard in 1925, often prioritized the stability of the pound sterling over the economic health of the dominions and colonies, leading to resentment. Simultaneously, the war had accelerated the growth of nationalist movements across the empire. Colonial subjects, having fought for the empire, were no longer content with promises of eventual self-rule. They demanded immediate and meaningful political change. In India, the independence movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, gained unprecedented popular support. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, nonviolent civil disobedience, mobilized millions. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, where British troops killed hundreds of unarmed protesters, became a powerful symbol of imperial repression, galvanizing Indian resistance and discrediting British claims of a civilizing mission. Britain responded with a mixture of limited reforms, like the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935, which introduced some provincial autonomy, and continued repression, creating a tense and volatile situation. Ireland, after centuries of British rule, achieved partial independence in 1922 following the Anglo-Irish War, 1919-1921. The creation of the Irish Free State, a dominion, and the partition of Northern Ireland, which remained part of the UK, represented a significant loss for the empire and a template for future decolonization through armed struggle. The dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, continued their evolution towards greater autonomy. Their wartime contributions had earned them a stronger voice. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 stated that they were autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs, though united by a common allegiance to the Crown. This was formalized by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which effectively granted them legislative independence. This transformed the empire into a looser Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states, albeit still centered around Britain. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, dealt another severe blow to the empire. Global trade collapsed, commodity prices plummeted, and unemployment soared. Imperial preference schemes, designed to foster trade within the empire, offered only limited relief. The economic hardship intensified nationalist grievances in many colonies, as local economies were often tied to the fortunes of the struggling imperial center. In the Middle East, Britain's new mandates, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, proved challenging to administer. Conflicting promises made during WWI, to Arabs for independence and to Jews for a national home in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, created simmering tensions that erupted into violence, particularly in Palestine. Britain struggled to reconcile its strategic interests with the growing nationalist aspirations of the local populations. Meanwhile, new external threats began to emerge. Britain, weakened by economic depression and reluctant to engage in costly new conflicts, often pursued a policy of appeasement, inadvertently emboldening these aggressors. By the late 1930s, the British Empire, though still vast, was no longer the unassailable power it had been. Its economic foundations were strained, its political cohesion was being tested by the rise of nationalism and the increasing autonomy of its dominions, and it faced formidable new challenges from rising totalitarian powers. The interwar period was a crucial preparatory phase for the ultimate test that would arrive in 1939, a test that would prove to be the final decisive blow to the traditional model of the British Empire. World War II and the Accelerated Path to Independence, 1939-1945. Just 2 decades after the war to end all wars, the world plunged into an even more destructive conflict, World War II. For the British Empire, this was not merely a war for survival, but a crucible that would accelerate its transformation and ultimately hasten its demise. Though the empire rallied to Britain's side, contributing immensely to the Allied victory, the war profoundly weakened the imperial power, exposed its vulnerabilities, and ignited an unstoppable wave of decolonization. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939, the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa swiftly followed suit, demonstrating remarkable loyalty, though South Africa's declaration was more contested internally. India's participation was declared by the Viceroy without consultation, further fueling nationalist resentment. Across the vast imperial network, millions mobilized for war. The empire's contribution was crucial. Colonial resources, from oil in the Middle East to rubber in Malaya and vital minerals from Africa, flowed to the British war effort. The industrial output of Canada and Australia became increasingly important. More than 2.5 million Indian soldiers served, forming the largest volunteer army in history, fighting in North Africa, the Middle East, Italy, and Asia. African soldiers and laborers played vital roles in various campaigns, and Caribbean volunteers served in Britain and other theaters. However, unlike the First World War, this conflict directly threatened imperial territories and prestige. The fall of Singapore in 1942 to the Japanese, an impregnable fortress and symbol of British power in Asia, was a devastating blow. It shattered the myth of British invincibility and demonstrated that European imperial powers were vulnerable to Asian forces. The rapid Japanese conquest of Malaya, Burma, Hong Kong, and other territories exposed the limitations of British military power, particularly when stretched thin across a global empire. The war also saw the rise of the United States as a global power, often openly critical of European colonialism. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's vision of a post-war world emphasized self-determination and open markets, directly challenging the foundations of the British Empire. The Lend-Lease Act and crucial American aid kept Britain afloat, but came with implicit and explicit pressures for decolonization. The war's ideological battle against fascism and Nazism, fought in the name of freedom, democracy, and self-determination, created a powerful paradox for an empire that still ruled vast populations without their consent. Colonial subjects increasingly questioned the legitimacy of their own subjugation when fighting for the liberation of others. Why should they fight for freedom abroad if they did not have it at home? Economically, Britain emerged from World War II even more financially crippled than after the First. Its cities were devastated, its industries geared for war, and its overseas investments had been liquidated to fund the war effort. It was deeply in debt, particularly to the United States and India. Maintaining the empire, let alone rebuilding Britain, became an unsustainable burden. Politically, the post-war Labour government, elected in 1945 with a mandate for social reform and a less imperialist outlook, was also more pragmatic about the empire's future. Faced with overwhelming debt, a powerful nationalist wave, and American pressure, the path to decolonization, particularly for India, seemed inevitable and urgent. World War II marked the definitive turning point for the British Empire. It exposed its vulnerabilities, drained its resources, empowered nationalist movements, and shifted global power dynamics away from Europe. While the empire had contributed immensely to the Allied victory, the price of that victory was its accelerated transformation into something fundamentally new. The formal end of empire was now a matter of when, not if. India's independence and partition, 1947. The year 1947 stands as the most iconic moment in the story of decolonization. After nearly 2 centuries of British rule, India, the jewel in the crown, finally gained its independence. But this momentous achievement was tragically intertwined with the brutal reality of partition, the division of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, a decision that unleashed unprecedented violence and mass displacement, leaving scars that endure to this day. The Indian independence movement had been building for decades, gaining momentum through the nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns led by Mahatma Gandhi and the political organizing of the Indian National Congress. By the end of World War II, Indian independence was seen by many within Britain as inevitable, but the question of how and when remained highly contentious. However, the path to a united independent India was complicated by deep-seated religious and political divisions between India's Hindu majority and its significant Muslim minority. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, increasingly argued that Muslims would be marginalized in a Hindu-majority India and demanded a separate Muslim state. Pakistan. British policymakers, including the last Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, faced an immense challenge. The post-war British government, led by Clement Attlee, was determined to withdraw from India quickly, fearing a chaotic and costly civil war if they stayed. This urgency, however, arguably contributed to the rushed process of partition. The decision to partition India was announced in June 1947, with a target date of August 15th for independence. The process of drawing the new borders between India and West and East Pakistan, the latter later becoming Bangladesh, was haphazard and rushed, overseen by a British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India before. The Radcliffe Line, drawn just weeks before independence, cut through villages, farms, and homes, dividing communities along arbitrary lines. The announcement of partition, combined with the rapid British withdrawal, triggered an explosion of communal violence. Hindus and Sikhs in areas designated for Pakistan and Muslims in areas designated for India found themselves on the wrong side of the new borders. Fear, hatred, and rumors fueled unprecedented massacres, arson, and sexual violence. One of the largest mass migrations in human history ensued, as an estimated 14 to 18 million people crossed the newly drawn borders, seeking safety in their respective religious homelands. Millions became refugees overnight, walking for days, often facing attacks and death along the way. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people. On August 15, 1947, India gained its independence, followed by Pakistan. A joyous moment of liberation was tragically marred by the bloodshed and displacement. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, famously spoke of India's tryst with destiny as the clock struck midnight, but the joy was undeniably tempered by the immense suffering. The partition of India was not just a humanitarian catastrophe. It created two new, often adversarial nations with enduring border disputes, e.g., Kashmir. It fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of South Asia, and its legacy continues to shape the region's politics, identities, and conflicts. For Britain, India's independence marked the formal end of its largest and most economically significant imperial possession. While a tremendous source of pride for its role in granting independence, the chaotic and bloody nature of partition also cast a long shadow over its imperial legacy. The swift withdrawal, driven by post-war exhaustion, effectively left the subcontinent to grapple with the immense consequences of a hastily executed division. India's independence signaled that the sun was truly beginning to set on the British Empire, setting a powerful precedent for other colonies seeking their own freedom. The wind of change. Decolonization across Africa and Asia, 1945-1980s. India's independence in 1947 wasn't an isolated event. It was the strongest gust in what Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would famously call the wind of change, sweeping across the rest of the British Empire. The post-World War II era saw a rapid, almost unprecedented wave of decolonization as Britain, weakened and facing an irresistible tide of nationalism, granted independence to dozens of its remaining territories in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Several factors converged to accelerate this process. Britain's economic exhaustion after World War II made maintaining a vast empire increasingly unsustainable. The moral authority of imperialism was severely undermined by the war against fascism, and the new global order championed by the United States and the Soviet Union, both ideologically opposed to traditional colonialism. Finally, and most powerfully, organized and increasingly sophisticated nationalist movements, often inspired by India's success, demanded self-rule. In Asia, beyond India, independence came swiftly. Burma, Myanmar, gained independence in 1948. Malaya, a vital source of rubber and tin, achieved independence in 1957 after a prolonged and brutal communist insurgency, showcasing a complex blend of military victory and political negotiation. The Federation of Malaya then expanded to form Malaysia in 1963. Singapore briefly joined Malaysia before becoming an independent city-state in 1965. However, it was Africa that experienced the most dramatic wave of decolonization, particularly in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This period is often dubbed the Year of Africa, with 17 African nations gaining independence in 1960 alone. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from Britain in 1957 under the charismatic leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. His peaceful but determined struggle became an inspiration for other African nationalists. In Kenya, the path to independence was more violent. The Mau Mau Uprising, 1952-1960, a brutal insurgency against white settler rule and British colonial authority, led to harsh British counterinsurgency tactics, including mass detentions and atrocities. Despite the violence, the rebellion eventually forced Britain to accelerate its timetable for independence, which came in 1963 under Jomo Kenyatta. Nigeria, a vast and diverse country, achieved independence in 1960. Other British colonies in West Africa, like Sierra Leone and Gambia, followed suit. In Central and East Africa, nations like Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi also gained their freedom through various processes, some peaceful, some with significant internal strife. The transfer of power often involved a careful balancing act, as Britain sought to hand over control to stable, pro-Western governments, often attempting to establish parliamentary democracies and common law systems. British civil servants and military officers gradually withdrew, replaced by local administrations. However, the legacy of colonial rule and the speed of decolonization often created immense challenges for the newly independent nations. Arbitrary colonial borders frequently encompassed diverse ethnic and religious groups, leading to internal conflicts. Underdeveloped economies, reliant on raw material exports and lacking diversified industries, faced daunting challenges. The sudden withdrawal of experienced colonial administrators sometimes left a vacuum, leading to instability. In southern Africa, the process was protracted due to entrenched white minority rule. Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, achieved independence only in 1980 after a long and bloody liberation struggle against its white minority government, which had unilaterally declared independence in 1965. South Africa, having already achieved Dominion status in 1910, remained under apartheid until 1994, becoming the last major colonial power to dismantle its system of racial oppression. By the 1980s, the vast majority of Britain's formal empire had gained independence. What remained were small island territories and dependencies, often too small or strategically important to become fully independent. The wind of change had truly transformed the world map. Britain, once the ruler of a quarter of the globe, was now a medium-sized European power. The story of its empire was largely over in terms of territorial control, but its enduring legacy, both positive and negative, had only just begun to unfold. The Commonwealth, a new relationship, post-1945, present. As the British Empire dismantled itself, giving way to a mosaic of independent nations, a new, unique institution emerged from its ashes, the Commonwealth of Nations. Far from being a mere relic of empire, the Commonwealth evolved into a voluntary association of independent sovereign states, seeking to foster cooperation, shared values, and mutual understanding. Its story is one of adaptation, reinvention, and the enduring complex ties that bind former ruler and ruled. The concept of the Commonwealth originated in the early 20th century with the granting of Dominion status to settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 formally recognized their independence and laid the legal framework for a voluntary association of equals, united by allegiance to the British Crown. However, the true transformation of the Commonwealth occurred after World War II, with the rapid decolonization of India and other non-white colonies. The pivotal moment came in 1949, with the London Declaration. India, upon becoming a republic, wished to remain a member of the Commonwealth, but could no longer swear allegiance to the British Crown. The Declaration famously allowed member states to recognize the British monarch as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth without implying political allegiance. This paved the way for republics and nations with their own heads of state to join, fundamentally changing the Commonwealth from a British entity to a Commonwealth of Nations. This redefined Commonwealth was a flexible, non-binding association. Its core principles, enshrined in documents like the Singapore Declaration, 1971, and the Harare Declaration, 1991, emphasize democracy, human rights, rule of law, and economic development. It operates through regular heads of government meetings, CHOGM, where leaders discuss global issues and common challenges. Today, the Commonwealth comprises 56 member states, spanning every continent and representing over 2.5 billion people, nearly a third of the world's population. It includes some of the world's largest economies and smallest island nations, the richest and the poorest, representing immense diversity in culture, religion, and political systems. What binds them, beyond shared history, is a commitment to common values and mutual support. The British monarch continues to serve as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth, a purely ceremonial role with no political power. For many former colonies, especially those that chose to retain the monarch as their own head of state, Commonwealth realms, this figure represents continuity and a shared historical link. For republics within the Commonwealth, the head of the Commonwealth signifies the historical connection without infringing on their sovereignty. The Commonwealth is not without its criticisms. Some argue it is a colonial hangover, a relic of empire that perpetuates unequal power dynamics. Others question its effectiveness in enforcing its stated values, particularly regarding human rights and democracy, pointing to past failures to sanction member states. However, supporters argue that the Commonwealth provides a unique forum for dialogue, cooperation, and development, particularly for smaller states who benefit from a collective voice on the global stage. It facilitates cultural exchange, educational links, and sporting events like the Commonwealth Games, fostering a sense of community and shared identity that transcends geopolitical boundaries. The Commonwealth represents Britain's most enduring and adaptable imperial legacy. It demonstrates a move from direct domination to a more subtle form of influence, built on shared history, language, often English, and institutions. It is a testament to the complex, often ambivalent relationship between former colonial powers and their independent successors. As it continues to evolve in the 21st century with new members joining who were never part of the British Empire, like Rwanda and Gabon, the Commonwealth continues to redefine itself, perhaps moving further away from its imperial roots to become a truly global multilateral organization based on shared principles rather than historical ties. Legacy and reassessment, present day. The sun has long set on the British Empire as a territorial entity, but its shadow, both long and complex, continues to stretch across the globe. From the linguistic tapestry of nations to the very borders on our maps, from the structures of law and government to the enduring inequalities and conflicts, the legacy of the British Empire is not merely a chapter in history. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape our present and influence our future. Perhaps the most pervasive legacy is the English language. Spoken as a first or second language by billions, it serves as a lingua franca for global commerce, diplomacy, and science. This linguistic dominance is a direct inheritance of imperial rule, facilitating communication, but also, for many, representing a continuing form of cultural hegemony. British legal and administrative systems were transplanted across the empire, influencing the development of common law, parliamentary democracy, and civil service structures in numerous independent nations. While often adapted to local contexts, these institutions remain a fundamental part of the governance in many former colonies, embodying aspects of British political thought and practice. The empire also left a physical legacy. Vast infrastructure projects like railways, roads, ports, and telegraph lines built to facilitate British trade and control. These infrastructures, while often designed for imperial benefit, became vital arteries for the development of post-colonial nations, though often at great human and environmental cost. However, the legacy of the British Empire is undeniably fraught with profound and often devastating negative impacts. The exploitation of resources drained wealth from colonies, often enriching Britain at the expense of local development. The imposition of cash crops often led to food shortages and famines, as seen in India and Ireland. The drawing of arbitrary borders by colonial powers, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, disregarded existing ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. This artificial fragmentation often sowed the seeds for future internal conflicts, civil wars, and regional instability in the post-colonial era. The pervasive ideology of racial superiority and social Darwinism left a deep and painful legacy of racial discrimination, segregation, and dehumanization that continues to impact social structures and identities in many former colonies and in Britain itself, as evidenced by ongoing debates about historical injustice. The very concept of a globalized economy, while predating the British Empire, was profoundly shaped by its vast trade networks, financial systems centered in London, and the imposition of free trade principles that often benefited Britain. This has contributed to persistent economic inequalities between former colonial powers and the developing world. In Britain itself, the empire's legacy is equally complex. It shaped British identity, culture, and wealth. Modern Britain is a multicultural nation with significant populations originating from former colonies, enriching its society, but also prompting ongoing debates about immigration, national identity, and historical memory. The empire's impact is not just historical, it manifests in contemporary debates about reparations for historical injustices, the return of cultural artifacts, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and justice by indigenous peoples and descendants of enslaved populations. Ultimately, the history of the British Empire is a story of immense power, ambition, and transformation, but also one of profound contradictions. It brought railways and famine, legal systems and brutal exploitation, educational opportunities and cultural destruction. Its study forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, race, and global inequality. It is a story of human ingenuity and cruelty, of triumph and tragedy, leaving an indelible mark on the world, shaping the geopolitics, cultures, and economies of today. To understand our present, we must reckon with this colossal past. The story of the British Empire is an epic saga spanning centuries, charting the transformation of an island nation into a global superpower that, at its peak, governed nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Its trajectory, marked by ambition, innovation, exploitation, and eventual decline, left an indelible mark on global history, shaping modern economies, political systems, languages, and cultures. The empire's origins were far from imperial. Medieval England, a nation forged from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Norman conquest, was initially preoccupied with internal strife and continental European ambitions. Figures like Alfred the Great laid foundations for a unified English monarchy, while the Norman conquest of 1066 solidified a centralized state and integrated England more deeply into European affairs. Centuries of conflict, particularly the Hundred Years' War with France, ultimately led England to shed most of its continental holdings, forcing a focus inward on its island identity. The tumultuous Wars of the Roses finally ended with the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, bringing stability and setting the stage for outward expansion. The Tudor era, especially under Elizabeth I, saw England begin its tentative steps onto the global stage. While Spain and Portugal dominated early exploration, English mariners like Francis Drake challenged Spanish supremacy through privateering and circumnavigation. Early colonial ventures, such as the ill-fated Roanoke settlement, highlighted the immense difficulties of overseas expansion. Crucially, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 cemented England's naval prowess, and the formation of the East India Company in 1600 introduced a new model for commercial expansion, paving the way for future dominion in Asia. The Stuart monarchs oversaw the establishment of England's first permanent colonies. Jamestown in Virginia, 1607, became the first enduring settlement in North America, thriving on tobacco cultivation. However, this success came at a terrible cost, leading to the introduction of African chattel slavery in 1619 to meet labor demands, an institution that would fuel immense wealth, particularly in the Caribbean sugar islands. Meanwhile, Puritan settlements in New England diversified the colonial landscape. Back home, internal conflicts like the English Civil War and the subsequent Glorious Revolution of 1688 reshaped British governance, leading to a constitutional monarchy with a powerful parliament. The Acts of Union in 1707 formally united England and Scotland into Great Britain, providing a unified and strengthened home base for global ventures. The 18th century was defined by intense competition with European rivals, primarily France, for global dominance. A series of conflicts, culminating in the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, transformed Britain into the undisputed global maritime and colonial power. Key victories in North America, French and Indian War, and India, Battle of Plassey under Robert Clive, effectively dismantled French imperial ambitions in these vital regions. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, marked the zenith of Britain's First Empire, but also contained the seeds of its first major loss. The triumph of 1763 was short-lived in North America. The American Revolution, 1775-1783, fueled by grievances over taxation without representation and a growing sense of American identity, led to the loss of the 13 colonies. This humiliating defeat forced Britain to reassess its imperial strategies, leading to a reorientation towards the East and new forms of colonial rule. Despite this setback, Britain's imperial trajectory continued. The Napoleonic Wars, 1792-1815, saw Britain emerge as the world's leading naval power, thanks to figures like Horatio Nelson and victories like Trafalgar, 1805. This period ushered in the Pax Britannica, a century of relative global peace and British dominance, underpinned by its powerful navy and burgeoning industrial revolution. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally reshaped the empire. Britain's factories demanded vast quantities of raw materials from its colonies and, in turn, needed vast markets for its manufactured goods. Technological innovations like steamships, railways, and the telegraph facilitated unprecedented control and integration of the empire. This industrial might also provided a new justification for empire: the civilizing mission, a paternalistic ideology that claimed Britain was bringing progress and order to backward societies. The 19th century witnessed the full bloom of British imperial power. In India, the East India Company solidified its control, and after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, India came under direct crown rule, becoming the jewel in the crown. Elsewhere, Australasia was settled, initially as penal colonies, while the Cape Colony in southern Africa became a vital strategic outpost. The late 19th century saw the frantic scramble for Africa, where European powers carved up the continent. Britain acquired vast new territories, often after brutal conflicts like the Anglo-Boer Wars. Strategic interests in the Middle East, particularly control of the Suez Canal, further expanded Britain's global reach, driven by the desire to secure routes to India and access to newly discovered oil resources. However, the empire's peak was also its prelude to decline. World War I, 1914-1918, placed immense strain on Britain's resources, both human and financial. Millions of colonial subjects fought for the empire, returning home with a heightened sense of national consciousness and demands for self-determination. The interwar period, 1918 to 1939, saw the rise of powerful nationalist movements, most notably in India under Mahatma Gandhi, and the growing autonomy of the Dominions, formalized by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. World War II, 1939-1945, delivered the decisive blow. Despite the empire's crucial contributions to the Allied victory, Britain emerged economically exhausted and morally diminished. The fall of Singapore shattered the myth of imperial invincibility, and the rise of the anti-colonial United States accelerated the inevitable process of decolonization. The post-war era saw the rapid dismantling of the empire. India gained independence in 1947, tragically accompanied by the violent partition into India and Pakistan. This set a precedent for a wind of change that swept across Africa and Asia. Nations like Ghana, 1957, and Nigeria, 1960, achieved independence, often after challenging periods of nationalist struggle or violent insurgency. By the 1980s, the vast majority of Britain's formal empire had dissolved. From the ashes of empire emerged the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent sovereign states largely comprising former British colonies. It transitioned from a British entity to a broader community united by shared values and cooperation, recognizing the British monarch as a symbolic head. The legacy of the British Empire remains deeply contested. It undeniably left behind enduring legal systems, parliamentary democracies, infrastructure, and the widespread use of the English language. However, it also left a painful legacy of exploitation, famine, arbitrary borders that fueled post-colonial conflicts, and systemic racial discrimination that continues to impact societies today. Debates about reparations and the return of cultural artifacts highlight the ongoing reckoning with this complex past. Ultimately, the British Empire's history is a multifaceted narrative of expansion and contraction, of power and injustice, of innovation and exploitation. It was a global force that profoundly shaped the modern world, and its understanding remains essential for comprehending the geopolitical, economic, and social realities of our time.